So in 1916, France had survived the drama and the tragedy of Verdun. Its war economy had gotten onto a solid enough footing that it was prepared for a conflict in the long term. But at the same time, it has to be acknowledged that the Union Sacrée, the sacred union that was supposed to keep France united over the course of the war, was beginning to fray by the end of 1916, early 1917. There were signs that some elements within each of these different sections of French society had had enough of the conflict. Actually, some of the most outspoken critics of the war effort initially were French feminists. So Louise Samanou was a French socialist. She had always adopted a pretty strong pacifist approach to the war, and believed that the war essentially was nothing more than the slaughter of the working class men of Europe. And so she attended various conferences and in Switzerland trying to promote pacifism. Hélène Briand was a French school teacher. She was also a feminist, albeit from more of a socialist background, but likewise by 1916 was starting to become a vocal critic of the French war effort. It wasn't just among feminists that we were starting to hear voices opposed to the war. The various socialist groups in France, so the Socialist Party, or the Confédération Générale du Travail, the major trade union network. Starting in 1915, voices were beginning to be heard within these two groups opposed to the war. Initially, they were small minority voices, but by the middle of 1916, about half of the Socialist Party had come to adopt a position that peace needed to be found. That victory in of itself, that a kind of endless pursuit of victory was not for the benefit of the ordinary working man of Paris or ordinary working man of France, and something needed to be done in order to try and bring about an end to the conflict. Not necessarily a victory, but an end to the conflict. These voices were encouraged by the publication of one author, Henri Barbusse. He talked about the fire, essentially relating his experiences, what it was like on the front in the trenches during the First World War. The book sold about 200,000 copies, and he was certainly another loud advocate for some kind of road to be found for peace. Not French victory, but for peace. The war in 1917, of course, was affected by a couple of major international developments that were going to have a significant impact on the war in France as well. Firstly, we had the February Revolution in Russia in 1917, where the Tsar was overthrown, a democratic republic government emerged in its place, and although the Russian government under Kerensky committed to staying in the war, the reality was that morale amongst the Russian army had collapsed by 1917, and that the Russia had essentially disintegrated as an effective fighting force. That was obviously bad news for France, but the good news was that in April 1917, the United States entered the war as a response to repeated German attacks upon American ships, or at least the refusal of the Germans to acknowledge the rights of neutral ships to cross the Atlantic. Now, the United States Army was pretty small in 1917, so in terms of the benefit of American manpower, it was understood that would not immediately come to bear in the war, albeit the hope was that eventually it would make a difference. But certainly the contribution of American supplies, American money, provided a badly needed bolstering for the French army. Joffre had been replaced as commander of the French by Robert Nivelle by the end of 1916, and Nivelle in some ways encouraged by these developments, especially the likelihood of the American ending the war, decided that the army should go on the offensive. And so in April 1917, Nivelle ordered an enormous offensive on the Western Front, hoping to finally achieve the breakthrough through the German lines and provide a path to victory for the British and French soldiers on the Western Front. Nivelle's offensive fared no better than those of Joffre, and what resulted was a slaughter. The French army lost almost 150,000 men in a 2-week period. The results of Nivelle's offensive were catastrophic, and what it provoked within the soldiers was mutiny. And when I say mutiny, it kind of manifests itself in different ways. There were a small number of soldiers who called for immediate end, simply to stop fighting and demand immediate peace. Others had voiced slogans and revolutionary calls for a socialist overthrow of the French government. But most French soldiers, they weren't committed to abandoning the war, but they simply refused to take part in any more offensive maneuvers. Their argument was that these offensive maneuvers are pointless. We don't mind dying for France, but we do mind dying pointlessly, charging at well-armed German defensive positions. So as a result, Nivelle, who was the commander, was fired and replaced with Pétain. Excuse me. And Pétain, by nature a kind of cautious general anyway, realised that, when I say realised, kind of had his opinion reaffirmed by Nivelle's action that essentially the First World War had to be a defensive war and that any kind of offensive action would be suicidal. So under Pétain, he took a number of steps to try and quell the mutiny. Firstly, he had some of the leaders rounded up. About 3,000 French soldiers were arrested, 49 of whom were executed for treason, although obviously the majority of them were spared. He then began trying to improve basic conditions amongst the conditions for the French soldiers, so trying to improve the food, trying to improve the regularity with which they could travel home for needed breaks. But perhaps the most significant change he introduced was essentially a commitment that going forward there will be no more major offensive campaigns, that the French army will rely on its defense to hold off the Germans, but will not commit to kind of suicidal attacks upon German positions. And these measures did enough to win the confidence of the French soldiers, and essentially they accepted Pétain's changes, his guarantees that their lives would not be wasted needlessly, and this helped end the mutiny amongst the French soldiers. But while there was discontent on the fronts, this in some ways echoed growing discontent back in France itself, or back on, when I say back in France, I mean on the home front. There were a series of strikes beginning in late 1916 into 1917, factory workers demanding better pay, including in some cases female factory workers insisting that they were being underpaid for their work. And so it is this combined with the mutinies on the army front kind of created a sense that perhaps France was starting to fall apart at the seams a little bit and raised questions about whether it could continue to sustain an offensive or sustain itself in the war. And what we know is that over the course of 1917, some important French politicians, so the man on the left, Joseph Caillou, who had been prime minister for a period before the war, Astrid Briand and Paul Painlevé, were important members of the French government. All of them had various contacts with members of the German government, trying to find a path to peace. So not in any kind of official capacity, but unofficially, they were the three in different capacities were trying to open up back channels to establish a connection with the German government towards possible peace negotiations. And I think that speaks volumes to the kind of growing desperation amongst the French leadership about the impact the war was having on France, both in terms of its military and its domestic scene. The talks ultimately kind of came to nothing, or these kind of opening negotiations, in large part because the minimum French demand to end the war was, of course, the return of Alsace-Lorraine, something that the Germans simply wouldn't countenance. So these talks ultimately did not lead to any kind of substantial peace negotiations, but it did show that there was a recognition amongst many leading politicians in France that something needed to be done, that the war needed to be ended for the kind of for the benefit of French society as a whole, and that the heroic war effort that was envisioned in 1914 simply no longer was a reality.